Welcome back to the Pirate Republic. This is an audiobook presentation of Pirates of the Wild West, the first novel in the Storm of Time series, released one chapter at a time. Today's chapter is epic. The Queen Anne Revenge attempts to escape the harbor of San Francisco, only to find it being pursued by the ironclad, the Comanche, with Woodes Rogers captaining her. It's time to load those cannons. Wield your cutlass. This is Chapter 29, The Crossing. Chapter 29, The Crossing. A thin layer of fog held its fingers to the waters of the bay. It took most of the night to set the rigging and prepare the Queen Anne's Revenge for the voyage, but now they were finally underway. The winds were beginning to dissipate the fog layer and supply a helping push to the sails. The slow start was giving a chance for the sparse crew that now incorporated 2 land-raised cowboys to get their sea legs under them. The James brothers were so green on the ropes that Black Caesar needed to be ever watchful, so that they didn't hurt themselves or others as the booms swung port to starboard. The sun had yet to fully rise, but the bay traffic was beginning to pick up with the multitude of fishing boats heading out for their early start to the day. They had passed several of the trawlers with the fishermen staring and pointing in awe at the 17th century frigate that was crewed by the eclectic band of pirates. It had taken all hands to get the ship underway, and now Blackbeard stood on the aft castle manning the wheel, watching the incoming clouds and changing weather. He had wanted to escape this bay and be out on the open waters, but if a storm was coming, they would need to wait it out in the protection of this large inlet. He watched the traffic to see if any boats reversed course after hitting the ocean water, but it was probably too soon to judge. He had no map of these waters to help him navigate and anticipate the next cove or inlet that would grant his safety on their journey south. The scientist was moderately helpful as he knew several of the larger harbors they would encounter on their way to Mexico, but he had only seen them from land. Blackbeard's worry was that they would leave the safety of the bay, encounter a storm, and not find another cove before the ship would be wrecked once more, this time splintering to kindling against rocks or reef. Blackbeard had hoped to pass the San Francisco harbor in the cover of night or blanket of fog, but now it seemed the best course was to move swiftly under full sail past the busy port. He knew from Anne and the James brothers' report that Woodes Rogers had a ship of war at his disposal. That low-profile iron ship with its revolving turret of twin guns was now inducing nightmares in Thatch's thoughts. Charlotte was able to supply the fresh black powder for the Queen Anne's Revenge's 40 cannon, but Philip had advised him that they would be but a mere nuisance to the thickly plated ship. It was just as well since they had barely enough crew to man the rigging, let alone load and fire cannon. The Comanche was the moniker of the vessel, he was told. It was taken from the name of a fierce native tribe that had ruled the middle territories of the Americas. Blackbeard's only hope was to outrun the beast on the open waters. If this were a true approaching storm, the Comanche would suffer in rough seas with its deck a scant 18 inches above the surface. The Queen Anne, under full sail with brisk winds, would be able to best the ironclad's maximum speed of 7 knots from its steam-powered single screw. Tom felt his stomach lurch as the giant wooden mast moved with exaggerated motion under the rise and fall of the ship. From his perch high up in the crow's nest, he could see further than he ever had in his young life. This must be what it feels like to be in one of those balloons that carries people up into the sky, he thought to himself. He had seen balloons filled with hot air attached to people-holding baskets rise in the sky at a celebration near the City Hall of San Francisco. It seemed like magic until he overheard 2 adults explaining how it operated. Tom's pride peaked as he had neared the top of his climb after Captain Blackbeard assigned him "Look Out" and pointed to the nest at the highest spot on the ship. His hands had gripped the rope and netting with knuckle-whitening strength as he hastened up the tallest mast. Once he reached the top, he had looked down with a thundering heart to see his captain nod his head, confirming his trust in the newly recruited cabin boy. His sharp eyes now looked out on the dark blue bay, watching as the crowded San Francisco harbor emerged into view. Tom was tasked with alerting the crew of any oncoming obstacles either under the water or on top. He needed to anticipate where the ship would travel under its current course, and let the crew know if any adjustments needed to be made to keep the ship on a safe trajectory. He listened to the bellowing voice of Black Caesar as the big man called out orders. In return, the sailors called back their affirms that they heard the order and were following the directions. The voices of Mary, Ann, and Vane traveled loudly up to his ears. Jesse and Frank were gradually getting the hang of their positions, and their voices were sounding more confident as they cranked winches and tied off lines. He glanced down at the scientist as he moved around the deck with a spyglass, searching for danger. Tom would have liked to have had one of those devices as well, but the item was denied him for fear he would drop the valuable instrument from his perch. He watched as the harbor grew near and marveled at the many different vessels that crisscrossed one another on the water or sat moored at the docks that stretched out from the shoreline. Tom called out ships that could have the potential of crossing the Queen Anne's path as they entered the waters around the port. Those ships easily maneuvered to sail clear of the frigate, as they were well versed in navigating the crowded harbor. His heart was starting to ease as no one had spotted any danger from the other ships. It seemed they were viewed as just another vessel, though antiquated, on its way to the open sea. The captain steered the ship to port and around the rocky point that led to the channel where the bay emptied out into the Pacific Ocean. The wind grew stronger here, and the water's chop increased. He could see the high cliffs marking the narrowest part of the passage in the distance. Soon they would be free of the congested bay. He looked down at the scientist, peering intently over the fore railing, his feet braced against the rise and fall of the bow. It seemed the slight man had something that piqued his interest from his view through the spyglass. Tom followed the line of sight from Philip's stare and used his strong young eyes to spot the vessel they all feared encountering. The long, narrow form of the Comanche caught his eye as the 10-foot cylinder turret slowly rotated, searching for a target. The Comanche had parked itself in the center of the bay in that narrow channel. It was sitting low in the water, watching, waiting, threatening, as several men stood mid-deck looking for their prey. Philip peered through the spyglass and confirmed the crew of the Comanche consisted of the pirate hunter Woods Rogers and his dour associate Henry Jennings. In his view, he saw Woods point toward the Queen Anne and bark out orders. Woods and the men on deck all filed below as the ironclad and the turret began to turn in their direction. If Thatch had felt a sense of relief after passing the harbor unharassed, there was a new concern rising in his gut as the early morning boat traffic started heading back from the Pacific after venturing out to sea for just a short time. Now that they were in sight of the open ocean, the wind was blowing stronger and they were forced to tack aggressively in hopes of emerging from the bay. The horizon was full of dark clouds to the west, and the sunrise to the east was creating a glorious painting of colors across the foreboding sky. He longed for a larger, more experienced crew as he noticed Charlotte rushing over to help one of the cowboys work the rigging. Shouting suddenly broke through the sound of the sheets snapping and the bellows of orders from his first mate. It was coming from the cabin boy, high up in the crow's nest, but the message was getting lost in the wind as well as being difficult to decipher on account of the boy's Chinese accent. He looked up at the boy, and as the sheets moved and jerked, Thatch could see that the boy was pointing fore. Thatch looked down the deck and saw the little scientist was frantically making his way toward him, shouting as well. Without having to hear their words clearly, he knew they were about to encounter the ironclad ship and its enormous twin guns. Philip's head broached the top of the ladder to the aft castle, and the sound of both his voice and young Tom's combined in the same instant to ring out distinctly, "Comanche." "Man the forecastle gun!" Blackbeard shouted out. "It will do no good, Captain. Its skin is too thick with iron, too tough," Philip said. "Maybe we get lucky, Mr. Albert. Make her think twice. Just enough for us to get past her," Blackbeard said through gritted teeth, as he was finally able to make out the distant form of the ironclad from the starboard side as they tacked port. Both Anne and Vane ran to the swivel gun mounted on the forecastle railing. "I'll man her," said Vane. "I'm the better shot." "Bullocks, you say," Vane said, insulted. "I've seen you shoot when we's both on the Lark. Remember whose shot was more true that day we took a run at the Phoenix?" Anne said as she loaded and primed the small cannon. Vane stared at her and then at the approaching small target that the ironclad presented. He did remember that day where the HMS Phoenix blocked their escape from Nassau Harbor, and Anne and Mary far outshot the other crew members, including himself, allowing, in part, their escape. "I'll load you so we can be quick about it. Aim for that tower sticking out of the water, Vane said. Aye, just like shooting the member off a nude man floating in a lake, Anne said, straight-faced. Vane slapped her on the back. Anne, you are the right woman for the job, he said with a chuckle. Thatch paid little mind to the traffic oncoming from the sea in the direction of the bay. He needed all the speed and maneuverability the Queen Anne's Revenge could offer. Those other ships and boats would have to steer clear of his course, as he would not yield way. He also tacked to the outside of the other vessels, placing them between the Queen Anne and the Comanche. He hoped the pirate hunter's bloodlust wasn't so strong that he would open fire with innocent ships in the way. Thatch saw a steam vessel quite a bit larger than his traveling out to sea off his port side. On his next tack, he planned to put it in between him and the ironclad. Boom! The Comanche blasted a shell from one of its guns toward the Queen Anne's Revenge. The shot was high and sizzled past in a blink of an eye to explode into the rocky shoreline in an eruption of rock and dirt. All hands turned toward the destruction the single shell caused, and in unison back to the guns of the Comanche. Kaboom! The second gun fired and was wide, landing behind them in shallow water with an enormous splash, sending water 30 feet in the air. The crew of the pirate ship was frozen in panic by the sheer power of the guns. Come about! Blackbeard shouted, bringing his brethren back to life. He spun the wheel, and the crew worked the sails to erratically turn the ship to port. The wood groaned deep in the keel as the Queen Anne listed heavily into the turn. Tom, come down, boy! Mary shouted below the main mast at the cabin boy hanging on for dear life, high in the crow's nest. The top of the mast was now almost at a 45-degree angle, extending out far over the water. If the boy fell from there, he might survive, but would be lost in the cold waters of the bay. Tom could do nothing but cling to the rope railing of the perch while the ship made its turn, trying to escape the fire from the ironclad. Boom! Another round came at the Queen Anne, but luckily the turning ship was creating a smaller, faster-moving target. Thatch held the turn as they crossed the center of the channel, and once they were on the port side of the steamship, he spun the wheel to straighten the trajectory. The ship rocked in the opposite direction, and Tom was sent higher in the air as the mast rose up under the deck, then pivoted starboard before righting itself to its natural 90-degree angle. Tom had his eyes shut tight, and both arms wrapped around the rope rails. He opened one eye to see the steamship in between the Comanche and them. Mary's voice rose to him, shouting for him to come down. He looked below at her, nodded, and untangled his arms from the rope, then with shaking legs and arms started his descent. Blackbeard ordered his crew to spill the wind from the sails, slowing their speed to keep pace with the steamship. He wanted the Comanche to have no line of sight with them as they passed. The steamship's crew were running the decks in confusion, men pointing in both directions. They were now close enough for Thatch to hear their shouts and see the fear in their faces. The steamship's captain had several choices he could make. He could slow down, speed up, or move starboard closer toward the Comanche, but Thatch would give no quarter for the ship to come further to port. He wanted to keep the vessel right where she was until they passed the ironclad and could race out to the sea. Thatch saw the steamer's men looking at him in fear, shouting questions. Thatch pointed out to sea. The two ships were close enough now that their shouting could be heard. "Keep us steady, Mr. Albert," Thatch told Philip, giving him the helm. Thatch climbed down the aft castle and strode quickly to the starboard rail, his beard and hair blowing in the wind, looking like a black lion's mane. Several men from the steamer were at their railing and listened as Thatch's voice boomed across to them. "Make for the sea, or we'll blow you to bits," Thatch yelled as he loaded a starboard deck cannon and held a lighted linstock. "Faster, you swine!" he screamed at them. "She's hiding behind the steamer, Commander," called out the first mate of the Comanche from his position, watching from the viewport in the forward position. The ironclad had an armored box that rose above the main deck, about 3 feet tall for viewing. Using a ladder from below deck, the sailors could look out and navigate in the safety of the box, with several portholes that could be closed for protection from small arms, fire, artillery, and water flooding the inside. Jennings hovered near the first mate, watching through the portholes as the Queen Anne's Revenge disappeared from view behind the larger steamship. "Blackbeard will use that ship as cover. We should come around behind them," Jennings said. "We could lose them if they get too far ahead. Their ship will be faster in these winds, and we are already at a disadvantage with this chop in the bay. said the Comanche's commander, Charles McDougall. He had been told by his superiors that he was to assist in the capture or death of the James gang and these pirates who had robbed both a local bank and a train, killing federal and local law enforcement officers in the process. This was the first time since the Comanche was launched in '65 that it was seeing action, and he needed this mission to be successful. Blowing the antique frigate from the waters would be a shame, but if he was the man who ended the James gang's run, then he would be awarded a fistful of commendations and finally make the Navy rank of captain. Move to keep pace with them. We don't want to be left flat-footed when they pass, McDougall ordered. The Comanche throttled to intercept the ships as they rapidly approached the south side of the channel. Woods, Jennings, Cooper, and McDougall crowded the porthole to see what the intent of the steamer was going to be. If the damned ship would just slow down to let the pirates pass, we would be in a position to sink them with one shot, thought McDougall. Frustrated from his crowded, low view, he hurried up the ladder to the turret deck. The other 3 men followed him. The turret deck was located inside the 10-foot-tall, 15-foot-wide rotating cylinder. It was manned by 4 men working the rear-loading smoothbore guns with explosive shells. The turret also had narrow portholes through which to see outside. The twin guns continued to track the 2 ships sailing side by side, the pirate ship hiding behind the large steamer. They were all quick to see the steamer was not going to yield way and slow. Instead, she noticeably increased her speed to head out to sea with the pirates hiding in her shadow. "Bloody hell!" Woods exclaimed. "They're going to get away!" "Max speed!" McDougall yelled down below deck. "Max speed!" came the reply from the helmsman. The Comanche was now on a parallel course with the 2 ships, though she would be slowly falling behind as they reached the mouth of the bay. "Fire at that ship!" Woods screamed. The 4 men manning the guns looked unsure of themselves and stared at the lieutenant commander for orders. McDougall hesitated. If he fired on the innocent ship, would he be committing murder? If he didn't do something, the odds were greatly in favor of the pirate ship escaping. The main deck of the steamer completely obscured the pirate ship hiding on its port side. Not even the masts of the vessel were visible. McDougall turned from the porthole that he was watching from to come face to face with the scarred English captain. "Blast the top of that ship and it will send it careening into the pirates," Woods growled at him. "I can't risk the lives of the—" McDougall got out before Woods slapped the man in the face. McDougall bent over more in shock than pain and looked up at the pirate hunter looming over him. "How dare you!" he said, standing up. Woods grabbed the man by the shirt collar and shoved him into the bulkhead. Cooper grabbed at the 2 men and separated them, pushing Woods back. "Enough," Cooper said, pointing at Woods. "Enough, both of you." He then pointed at McDougall. "Our orders were to capture or kill these murdering thieves by any means necessary." He let that statement sink into McDougall's head. Cooper approached the commander and got right in his face. "By any means necessary," he repeated. McDougall stared at Cooper, then at Woods to see the seriousness of the men. He then turned to his gunners and said, "Open fire on that steamer. 1 volley." The gunners stared at the commander in shock. "I said fire, damn it! Now!" The gunners immediately went to work, sighting the steamer and calling out the position and firing orders. Blam! Blam! The noise and the concussion from the 15-inch guns was deafening and rocked the men on their heels. A split second later, the sound of the rounds hitting the mix of wood and metal from the steamer rocked the turret as well. Jennings stared out the porthole as the mid-castle of the steamer erupted in a burst of debris and fire, the force of the blast pushing the vessel to port, along with all the splintered projectiles that had once been the pilot house of the steamship. Mary screamed as the sound of the guns and explosions from the starboard side rocked the Queen Anne's Revenge with shrapnel and debris from the steamer. Tom was still 20 feet up the main mast when the Comanche's guns blew apart the middle section of the steamship. Her scream resonated in horror as the young boy lost his grip and fell from the dizzying height. The boy's arms and legs pumped the air as he grappled with the nothingness, falling toward his doom. Mary could do nothing but watch, her hand over her mouth. Suddenly, the mighty arms of Black Caesar were underneath him, catching him before the boy's body could smash against the solid deck of the ship. A split second later, the ship was rocked as the wake of the steamer being forced to port crashed into them, followed by the 2 ships banging together, then separating as the steamer veered starboard, away from them. The shock wave from the crash sent the entire crew slamming into whatever was near them. Vane and Anne held onto the swivel gun for support, waiting for their chance to fire a 3-inch round shot at the portholes of the ironclad. Jessie and Frank had held their ground with the help of the rigging and stood again with little more than a few scrapes. Charlotte threw off a stretch of sail that had been torn from the foretop mast and fallen to envelop her. She looked up and saw the remaining length of the sail blowing useless in the wind. Thatch made his way back up the aft castle ladder, calling out orders to whoever could hear them. "Full sail! 15 degrees starboard!" he yelled as he hurried over to help up a struggling Philip. The man had a gash on his forehead and didn't quite have his wits about him yet. Thatch knew they would need to tack alongside the veering steamer to keep it between them and the ironclad. He got the scientist to his feet and looked over at the out-of-control steamship. The pilot house was gone, and what was left underneath was aflame. He saw that it was turning sharply into the line of travel the ironclad must be sailing. That should give him a moment to put some distance between them. He took the wheel and gained control of the Queen Anne as the wind caught the sails and the crew began to make them full. Black Caesar was lying underneath the young cabin boy when Mary arrived to take Tom into her arms. The frightened and trembling boy clung tightly to her, and she soothed his pounding heart. She took his shoulders and held him in front of her. "Don't ever scare me like that again, you hear?" she said, and the boy nodded close to tears. She hugged him again quickly. "Anything broke?" The boy shook his head no. Black Caesar patted the boy on the back, then rushed off to help with rigging the sails for the chase. "You stick by me and do as I say," Mary told the boy. Then the two of them made off to assist where needed. Charlotte reefed the useless sheet so it would do no more harm to any of the nearby rigging. She expertly moved across the deck, inspecting the damage that the shrapnel from the blast had done. If they weren't racing for their lives, she would have little concern as the damage was minimal. As it was, the smallest tears in the sails would slow them down, and if the pressure on them became too great, those tears would enlarge until the sail would become useless. She found a sheet off the foremast, flapping futilely due to a severed line. Looking out at the slowing steamer, she expected the ironclad to emerge at any moment. Charlotte took a running leap and latched onto the netting of the mast, and with the dexterity of a cat ascended up to the topsail yard, 40 feet above the deck. She inched her way out on the yard, trying to match her balance with the motion of the ship. She reached up while holding the yardarm to grab the hanging end of the rope. She was inches away from grabbing it when she looked down to see the ironclad sailing into view. Her time was short, and the need for safety had passed. It was do or die. She let go of the yard and leaped up to grab the rope. Her hand clenched it, and her feet came back down to the narrow yardarm only to slip, and she began to fall from the mast. Charlotte still held her one-handed grip on the rope, pulling the sheet down with her as she fell. The effect was that the sheet caught the wind as it lengthened into place, slowing her descent, and she grabbed another yard with her other hand as she passed it, hanging from it, while the sheet tried its best to pull from her grip. Charlotte wrapped the rope around her wrist so it would not fling from her grasp. She pulled her legs up to wrap around the yard, further securing her to the precarious position. Hanging underneath the yard, she was able to tie off the sheet so that it would not come loose. Blam! Charlotte almost lost her grip in fright from the sound of a cannon blast. She looked down to see smoke escaping the 3-foot swivel gun being manned by Anne Bonny. "Take that, you scarred-faced dog!" Anne shouted as Vane reloaded the barrel. Her shot was fired just as the turret became visible from behind the steamer. The ironclad's nose was pointing starboard to escape running into the damaged steamer, which put some more distance between it and the Queen Anne's Revenge. Anne had heard and seen the round shot hit the iron plating of the wide turret, but she knew that it had barely scored the flesh of the beast. "Aim for the eyes!" Vane shouted. "What do you think I'm doing?" Anne shouted back. The turret was turning to take aim upon them, and Anne lined up her shot at one of the gun ports in hopes of blasting through the small opening. "Hard to port, 15 degrees, Thatch cried out from the wheel. The order was loudly repeated by Black Caesar. Anne felt the ship lurch and turn sharply. This caused her aim to be off. Blam! She fired again, but the shot went wide. It was just as well, she thought, as the Comanche had fired right after she did. Kabam! The shell would have most likely hit them if Thatch hadn't turned the ship at that moment. The man was smart, she'd give him that. He knew the ship and what she could do better than anyone. As the Queen Anne's Revenge turned away from the ironclad and the safety of the steamer's shadow, she lost the line of sight with this four-mounted gun. "Let's get to the aft cannon!" she shouted at Vane as she ran toward the rear of the ship. Jessie's eyes met hers as she ran past. There was a mixture of fear and excitement in those eyes as she passed him. "Give 'em hell, Annie!" he called, as she leaped over the ladder of the aft castle. She couldn't help but smile at his call of encouragement to her. She and Vane reached the gun a moment later, and the two of them worked together to load and prime the weapon with more speed than either thought possible. It was like instinct kicked in, and their hands worked as if they were attached to a single body. Anne lined up her shot as the ironclad sailed into view, waiting for the rise and fall of the ship to create the perfect arc to her target. Blam! Her iron round shot out of the cannon and a second later connected with the Comanche. Jennings saw the incoming shot as it streaked through the air toward him. He ducked down just in time as the 3-inch iron ball slammed into the 4-inch wide slit in the turret he had been staring out of. BAACLANG. Pieces of the iron ball burst through the hole, sounding like bees as iron shards ricocheted around the metal room. Jennings had his eyes closed and his arms wrapped around his bald head. His ears continued to ring long after the noise of the shot dissipated. He slowly opened his eyes and removed his arms. Blood seeped from his forearm, where a piece of metal shrapnel protruded from a wound. If he hadn't covered his head, this projectile would have been sticking out of his forehead. He looked around, realizing that he had been the lucky one. The lieutenant commander lay prone on the floor, eyes open but seeing nothing. A pool of blood was growing underneath his head. Cooper had taken a grazing shot to his cheek and one to his collar. The Wells Fargo man took out a handkerchief and pressed it to stop the bleeding. Woodes Rogers looked around the room at the dead man on the floor, then at the gunners who were standing unharmed. He strode over to Jennings and took his arm, helping him stand up. His face was inches away from Jennings. "Go below and take charge," Woods said, then ripped the shrapnel from Jennings' arm. He then turned to the gunners. "Don't just stand there like codfish. Fire on that ship." Vane let out a cheer as he saw the smoke and crack in the porthole appear after Anne's shot had hit its mark. "That porthole where you were aiming?" Vane said with a knowing snicker. "Close enough, don't you think?" Anne said as the two worked together to reload the cannon. "A finer shot I've never seen," Vane said, shaking his head, and squeezed her shoulder with his hand once the cannon was ready to fire. Blam! Anne fired another round. It slammed into the turret, giving it a good dent, but otherwise doing no further harm. Lightning flashed, and the crack of thunder echoed over the water as rain began to fall. The fast-moving storm had arrived to deliver stronger winds as they sped toward the open ocean. The boat traffic was giving the fighting ships a wide berth as they came back into the bay to escape the gale. The Queen Anne was tacking aggressively as it continued to slowly outpace the ironclad. The Comanche had no need to tack as its powerful screw pushed the beast straight ahead at a consistent 5 knots. Normally the calm bay would allow its speed to reach 7 or even 8 knots, but the swells and chop from the storm were battering the low-profile vessel quite badly. Thatch called back to Anne for a report on the ironclad. "She's falling behind, and I gave her one right in the eye." "Well done, lass. Keep harassing her till she's good and bloodied," Blackbeard called out. Jennings went below to the lower deck where the operations of the ironclad took place. The crew of 16 men went about their work, keeping the ship in the chase. Woods's 2 Navy men tried to look helpful, but they were completely out of place on the ship operating on only steam power. The 4 Wells Fargo men sat with their prisoner toward the bow of the ship where the crew bunks were kept. It seemed useless for the men to hover over their captive as there was nowhere to escape to. The commander has become a casualty of this war. It is an unfortunate turn of events that will not deter us from our mission of bringing these pirates to justice or kill them in the process. Captain Woodes Rogers of the Royal Navy has assumed command of the vessel. I am now the acting first mate. If there is any dissension, it will be dealt with swiftly and violently, as we are now under wartime orders. Jennings slowly looked around the room to see the expression on the faces of the Navy sailors. These men were more frightened than angry over the change in leadership. He nodded at Woods's Navy men, and they took position around the room along with Cooper's men. The sailors aboard the Comanche were not armed at the moment, so Jennings felt confident that they would not mutiny. "Let's give chase to these bastards and make them pay for the murders they've done," Jennings called out. With only a second of indecisiveness, the crew went back to their jobs and took up the call to action. The now former first mate came up to Jennings with a worried look. "Sir, the pumps are falling behind. The sea is swamping us and filling the bilge. It's slowing us down and the boilers are in danger of flooding." "Are all the pumps being utilized?" Jennings asked. "Not the manual ones. We'd need additional sets of hands." Jennings snapped his fingers for two of the Wells Fargo men to come help. "Take these two men and get them working the pumps. We need to keep this iron pot afloat," Jennings said. He then strode over to the ladder leading up to the armored porthole box that protruded above the top deck. He took caution as he leaned to look through, not wanting to meet another round shot coming straight at his eyes again. He could see the Queen Anne's Revenge tacking on the starboard side now as she made her run for the open water. The horizon was a frightening sight from his vantage point, just mere feet from the roiling waters. Boom! Boom! The twin guns sounded from behind his protected metal box. He winced as they echoed throughout the hull of the ship. He watched as the shots went wide, both hitting the water much closer to a terrified fishing trawler rushing in from the heavy seas than Blackbeard's ship. The guns of the Comanche could fire a great distance, more than a mile, but as with all naval warfare, hitting a moving target while you were in motion as well was never an easy task. Jennings watched as the Queen Anne reversed tack and made its way to port and out from the shelter of the bay. They were going to catch a wind now and would be able to avoid the need to tack, easily riding the wind southward. Jennings let out a sigh as the chase was now over. Boom! Boom! Went the Comanche's guns again, more out of frustration than the promise of success. Jennings could only imagine the dark scowl that must be covering Woodes Rogers' face right now. Thatch felt the deep rise and fall of his well-built 200-ton frigate as it cut through the growing swells. He watched as water splayed out in great splashes, as the forward end of the hull crashed down through the heavy sea. A smile grew from his lips as he saw and felt the sails fill to their maximum density of air as the wind pushed the ship to the speed of almost 10 knots. There was a cheer from the crew as Vane yelled a curse at the ironclad as it fell behind. The scientist, with his feet set far apart, peered at the Comanche through his spyglass. "She's not built for these seas. They do risk disabling or sinking her if they follow us," Philip commented. "Woods won't give up so easily, Mr. Albert, though I would love to see that beast go down to a watery grave with the pirate hunter inside." Philip kept his eye to the glass and said, "You're right, Captain. They are not straying from their course. You just might get what you desire if they continue to get swamped by the sea." Jesse James spun the winch as the boom passed over his and Frank's heads, swinging from one side of the ship to the other. The trial by fire of learning seamanship had allowed the brothers to learn the ways of the rigging in record time. The two men were in sync with each other as they worked with Black Caesar and Charlotte to keep the ship's sails filled with wind. "She's bucking like a wild bronco, Jesse," Frank said, as he allowed his feet to slide on the rain and seawater-soaked floor. Their boots slid on the slick surface, but each was already accustomed to the feeling and let the natural tilt of the ship bring them to the position they needed to be in. Both men were in fine shape and quite dexterous from a young age, roping and riding their way into adulthood. "I'm getting the hang of this sailing, but what I'd give to be on a horse galloping over dry land instead of this," Jesse said, as he worked to tie off the rope holding the boom in place. "Not bad, cowboy," Charlotte said as she looked at his knot. She was on the continued hunt to solve problems as they arose. Black Caesar pointed at a slack line and shouted to Frank, "Shore up that line!" And Frank hopped quickly to the task. Jesse heard the snapping of a loose rope and the clanging of an iron ring. He searched for the source of the sound. He looked along the sheets of the main mast and saw that the one in the middle was flapping about more than it should, the wind not being held inside creating slack in the line. He moved around the circumference of the largest mast on the ship to get a better look at the sail. "That ain't good," he said audibly to himself. He looked up to see a tear in the sheet that was quickly growing as the wind billowed through. "Reef that sail!" Charlotte called out. Reefing a sail was a lesson neither James' brother had been taught, and in seconds the entire length of the sail was split and flapping useless. The streams of the shredded sheet beat against the one below it, and a loose line whip-slapped that sail as well. Charlotte shouldered the cowboy out of the way and began to unloose the rigging to reef the troubled sail. Her efforts were too late, as the sheet below developed a rip that quickly traveled its entire length, rendering the sail useless. Charlotte looked at the other sails, and more tears were visible. It must have been the shrapnel from the steamship that poked holes throughout the assembly of canvas. Only now, under the strong winds and heavily enveloped air that pushed the ship forward, were the holes becoming tears and larger rips. If they continued at this pace, many more sheets would become useless before long. "Spill the wind!" yelled Charlotte. Black Caesar heard her command and looked up to see the sails developing holes. Damn, he thought to himself, they were almost free. He called out the order to spill the wind, and he, Mary, Charlotte, and the two brothers let the wind out of the sails to slow the ship down. Edward Thatch heard the order as well. He was about to rescind the call to keep up their speed, but from what he could see when he looked at the Queen Anne's sails, Charlotte was correct. They needed to reduce speed, or their sails would be ripped apart, and then they would become an easy target for the ironclad. Jennings watched as the Queen Anne's Revenge slowed down. She'd lost 2 sheets in less than a minute due to the strong winds. The fabric must have been damaged while it sat on the bottom of the bay, or by some scrap or debris blasted from the steamship. Whatever the cause, the tide just turned in his favor. He jumped down from his perch at the porthole and made his way to the turret-level ladder. "Keep with it, men. We almost have her. Helmsman, stay your course," Jennings called out to the crew. He emerged from below to find Woods turning toward him with a rare smile on his face. "The demon is losing sails. He can't outrun us now," Woods said. "Aye. These seas are heavy, though. More than this vessel was built to withstand. I fear the elements more than Blackbeard. I advise caution," Jennings said, while water continued to pour into the ironclad through the open gun ports, as the ship was swamped by each swell. "I will not be denied, Henry. God is with us, and we will prevail." Woods grabbed Jennings's shoulders. "Our journey is almost at an end. We will send them to their waiting graves. Then you and I will sail home, heroes once again." Jennings' stomach sank, either from the jolting rise and fall of the awkward vessel, or from Woods's denial of their real quandary from being lost in time. Woods turned away to watch through the gun ports as they closed the distance to the frigate. Jennings descended the ladder, shaking his head at the fact Woods still believed God was going to return them to 1718 once they killed all the pirates. There was magic at work here, but he couldn't follow the idea of God's hand being behind their time travel. He also didn't believe Blackbeard had any part in the mechanism of their journey, as he had once thought. He resigned himself to just accept his fate, finish this war with Blackbeard and Woods, then find his way back to Bermuda to live out his days. "Status, helmsman?" Jennings inquired. "The gunners should be able to make short work of her in a few moments. She's slowed to an estimate of 3 knots. We're making up ground, sir." "Good. Let's close the distance, blow her out of the water, and then escape this storm." Jennings went back to stare out the porthole box to watch the end of Blackbeard the pirate. I hope you're enjoying this historical fiction book with pirates and time travel all wound together in it. You can find the ebook and physical books at my website, briancantrell.com. You can also find the second book in this series, Pirates of World War II. And if you're a fan of pirates, you can check out thepiraterepublic.com. It's a weekly newsletter that I put out every Friday. All sorts of great pirate history, events, news, and happenings. You can also toss a few doubloons our way by joining our Patreon at Patreon, The Pirate Republic. We'll see you next week. Till then, fair winds and keep a weathered eye.